Welcome to the Committee for Oklahoma Prosperity podcast with Mike Mazie, CEO of Trinity Strategic Wealth, former state senator, and Oklahoma Secretary of Finance. Mike talks with public policy and industry leaders about needed transformative changes to make Oklahoma a top 10 state for people to live, work, and retire.
Hey friends, we're here with the next podcast of the Committee for Oklahoma Prosperity. I've really been looking forward to this one. Our friend Alex Gray is joining us today to talk about workforce and jobs and how that relates to some geopolitical issues as well. Alex is the CEO of American Global Strategies. He's a high-powered Oklahoma entrepreneur now after many years of being a policy expert. And I want to get this title right, Alex. I'm going to look at my notes. While you worked in D.C., you were the Deputy Assistant to President Trump and Chief of Staff of the White House National Security Council. I think I got all that correct.
Nailed it.
Now you and your wife Rochelle live in Oklahoma, and so one of our first questions is, after living in the pressure cooker world of Washington D.C., how would you compare living in Washington D.C. to living in good old Oklahoma now?
Well, it's great to be on with you, Mike. I grew up in Oklahoma City and spent almost 15 years in Washington, and it's so great to be home. I still go back to Washington quite a bit, and every time I get there, I just can't stop counting the minutes till I get back home again. I think the first thing that everyone knows, even people who aren't from Oklahoma, the moment you land in Tulsa or at Will Rogers and people smile at you and they ask you how your day is.
Such a huge difference.
Such a huge difference. And just the kindness and the generosity and how genuine people are. I'm not going to say that certainly there's some good people in D.C. and people who are trying to do good, but nothing compares to being back home in Oklahoma.
So we're in this amazing, bizarre election for a president season, Alex, and you had a firsthand view of the Trump years versus the Biden years. And for those of us in the finance and economics world, I'm sure there's some stark differences from your perspective. But what was it like working in the White House, and why do you think the Trump economic, policies were so successful for, job growth, higher wages across all demographics without the inflation problems that we have today?
Well, I mean, working at the White House was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and as a kid growing up in Oklahoma, I never would have dreamed I'd get to work in the West Wing and be a couple doors down from the Oval Office. I mean, it was just for a kid who was a politics nerd, and it was just a dream come true. Look, I think what President Trump did was unleash, the animal spirits of the American economy. It was very at its simplest level, taking regulations off the backs of our entrepreneurs, giving us stability, the ability to invest, to make hard-nosed financial decisions without worrying that the government's going to come in and do things to divert capital in non-productive ways. You look at the energy industry, unleashing American energy dominance, which from my perspective as someone who worked in national security, you can't think of a more geopolitically advantageous decision than what President Trump did for the energy sector. You look at tax reform, you look at the way that he incentivized through his corporate tax cuts and his individual tax cuts. He incentivized companies to actually reshore to America, to bring jobs back home. It was a supply side pro-growth administration that was focused on what matters, which is rising people's living standards. Rising tide lifts all boats. And what we've seen over the last 4 years, as you know well, Mike, it's the exact opposite. And what did we get? We got almost 10% inflation. We got high unemployment. We got inner cities that are decaying and crime that's out of control. We got exactly the opposite of what we had because the policy shifted 180 degrees away from growth.
Yeah, and I look at that 4-year Trump economy and the 4-year Biden economy. Like you, I'm a CEO of an Oklahoma business, and we've got 30 employees. And because of that huge run-up in inflation, we had a huge run-up in interest rates because the Federal Reserve was behind the wheel, or behind the curve, I should say. And, it was a pretty ugly bear market, that negatively affected clients and businesses across the country. Now the Fed's going to lower interest rates, this week, and I hope they're not too late. When you look at the landscape of Oklahoma's economy, Alex, and you're operating now in Oklahoma City, building a successful company, but still obviously with a global perspective because of American Global Strategies clients across the U.S. and across the world. How do you think the Oklahoma economy, is faring, and what do we need to be, doing differently going forward?
Well, look, the Oklahoma economy is, I think, by all metrics, outperforming the nation at large, and it's doing so because despite what's happening in Washington, as a general matter, we have a governor and we have a legislature that's pushing in the right direction on most metrics of economic growth. What I would like to see, and I think a lot of Oklahoma business leaders feel the same way, our tax code is still not competitive regionally. At the state level, we really need to be closer to Texas. We need to be closer to
Let's be a no-income tax state.
We need to be. And if we're not a no-income tax state, we're always going to be outcompeted by our neighbors. And if you're trying to bring, and I think Governor Stitt has done a tremendous job of trying to recruit business into the state, but if you're going to a multinational CEO and you're telling them, well, we'd like to see your C-suite, your corporate headquarters relocate to Oklahoma, he's going to look at Texas, and he's going to look at Arizona, which is headed towards 2%, and he's going to look at a lot of our neighbors, and he's going to ask, what's the comparative advantage? So, look, I think we have a supermajority in the state legislature. I think it is unacceptable that the legislature has not played ball with Governor Stitt and gotten us closer to zero.
Yeah, we've actually put forward the Committee for Oklahoma Prosperity, that is a 3-step process, which we've written about several times on how to become a no-income tax state. And the data is irrefutable. Tennessee is a no-income tax state, landlocked like we are, and they've had double the population growth on a percentage basis than we had the 10-year period from the data we saw from the last census, and they've got about 75% more GDP growth. So the numbers don't lie. As I look to hire people from the current workforce, as you've been building your company, we've had some challenges finding people to fill slots. Instead of weeks, it's taken us months. What do you see are the workforce challenges right now for your company and businesses like mine across Oklahoma?
It's something that I know you have this conversation with your colleagues, and I do as well. Every meeting I go to of the Chamber of Commerce or any gathering of business leaders in Oklahoma, workforce is the number one topic, even before taxes. And I think part of the challenge is, it goes back to education, and the Oklahoma education system continues to be an area where we have great room for improvement. And our universities are world class, and I think at the professional level, we're not having any trouble turning out folks kind of at the higher end of the spectrum. Where I'm struggling is finding, entry level folks who have soft skills, who have kind of the basic capabilities to join the workforce on day one. Look, COVID probably had something to do with it, because COVID took away, younger people's ability to have social interaction, to kind of do internships, to have basic, entry-level jobs while they were in school. And what we're seeing is people coming into the workforce now at 22, 23, they don't have a lot of experience doing the kind of basic soft skill stuff that you need if you're going to do your first corporate job. And so that's an area where we've really struggled to find talent. And I hope, as we think about education reform, I hope part of that is going to be helping to get younger people engaged in the workforce while they're still in high school, so that they're not taking this huge leap into the unknown when they enter the workforce for the first time.
Yeah, the nation's report card, which comes out of the group called the National Assessment of Educational Progress, recently released that only 20% of eighth graders in Oklahoma can read proficiently. So that's 80% that can't.
Yep.
You stretch that over 12 years, and unless we fix that, it means 500,000 young men and women aren't going to be ready for the workforce. And if we're going to be a top 10 state, we've got to get that fixed. We've got to get the tax code fixed, as you've already alluded to. Even, however, when we're all resolute about growth and helping our community get better and helping our state have more growth and prosperity, none of us are immune from those macro, national, global risks that are out there. And all of a sudden, given the weakness that we've been projecting abroad, at least in the last few years, I feel like I have to have sort of a plan B, plan C strategy, if you will, for clients, employees, given what may or may not happen on the geopolitical front. I know that's your area of expertise. We hear a lot about, China's got an appetite for Taiwan that produced most of the semiconductors in the world. How real is that risk? How should the nation be addressing that risk in a more serious manner, Alex?
Well, look, the threat from the Chinese Communist Party is, in my view, the greatest threat that the United States has ever faced from a national security perspective. We've never had a rival that has the economic, military, and geographic heft that the Chinese Communist Party have. The threat to Taiwan is extremely real. The former head of the U.S. Pacific Command said that it's probably going to happen between now and 2027. I've heard recently, and of course I've been out of government almost 4 years now, but I have friends who are still there who tell me that timeline may have gotten closer. Particularly, I would argue it's gotten closer because China is viewing the United States as a declining power and a weak power. That goes back to President Biden's disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, his failure to deter Russia and Ukraine. All of that has contributed to this. I think it's a misperception, but it is a real perception by the Chinese Communist Party leadership that we are a declining superpower who won't be able to prevent them from taking Taiwan. And so, look, the number one thing we can do, Mike, is to restore deterrence. That goes back to having the hard power, the military capacity to deter and to show that if necessary, we have the capacity and the capability to fight and win our nation's wars. But I think just as important, we have to have leadership in Washington that can show our adversaries that we have the will to use that force effectively, and this is why President Trump was the only American president since Ronald Reagan who didn't have a war under his watch, because he combined rebuilding our military with the strength and the courage of his convictions to deter adversaries, and that's what we have to go back to.
If the Harris team wins the White House, I think we're all concerned about the same type of, weak, fearful, we don't want to escalate any tensions, strategy that the Biden White House has focused on. Partisan politics aside, how much dangerous is that quote unquote, threat level if we have the Biden-Harris, Tim Walz perspective and strategy versus, the Trump deterrent strategy?
Yeah.
Do we just have to take that more seriously, or is that just sort of partisan hyperbole?
Look, I wish it was partisan hyperbole, but what I've seen over the last 4 years from the Biden-Harris team is a world that has been set on fire. And I couldn't have imagined when I left the White House January 20th, 2021, that we would have Iran basically unfettered in the Middle East, doing what it's done through its proxies in Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, that we'd have a full-scale conventional conflict in Ukraine, and that we'd have China putting increased pressure every day on Taiwan. I mean, I just couldn't imagine that we would go from the peace and stability and prosperity of the Trump era in just 4 years to what we're seeing today. And, Vice President Harris has never really offered her own perspective on foreign policy, national security. We don't really know what she thinks, but I think it's fair to say that as vice president for the last 4 years, she concurs with this policy. And if that's what she's going to implement, should she be elected president, I think we're going to be in a world of hurt.
Yeah. You bring up the Middle East. Obviously, the Hamas atrocities almost a year ago led to, the current war in Gaza. I imagine most people thought or hoped the Israeli Defense Force would have been able to clean up Gaza and, end military activities, in less than a year. That obviously is still going on, and there's threat of the conflict growing wider. I think a lot of Oklahomans, at least a lot of business people I talk to, are somewhat befuddled, Alex, by this determination of the Biden White House to focus on, diplomacy, and ceasefires versus let's help Israel get the job done and, get it over with and create more safety, in the region. What's your perspective on how Israel should deal with the threat against them, and how should the United States be operating in the Middle East so there's less risk of a broader war with Iran?
Well, I think you nailed it, Mike. I mean, Iran is the principal aggressor in the region. Iran is a threat to the United States, to Israel, to our Gulf Arab allies. Iran was empowered by the Obama administration's terrible nuclear deal in 2015. The Biden team has sought to bring that nuclear deal back. We now know that Iran is basically within weeks of becoming a nuclear power,
Didn't they just launch a satellite or something?
They've been launching satellites. They've been providing ballistic missiles to their proxies, so the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas. It's just an absolute disaster, and probably the area of the world where I think the Biden administration's weakness is going to most catch up with us the fastest. And look, Israel, not only does it morally have a right to self-defense, but from a U.S. strategic perspective, allowing Israel to defeat Hamas would be a tremendous victory against Iran, and it would be a victory for U.S. and Israeli security jointly. The Biden administration, I would argue, for domestic political reasons, is choosing to put as much pressure on Israel as it is on Hamas. And
I don't get that, Alex.
No, it's strategically flawed, and I think it's driven by their concerns about young voters who are generally, as we've seen on college campuses, at least closer to the Hamas perspective than they are to the Israeli perspective in too many cases. And look, we're seeing Israel now fighting a multi-front war that includes Lebanon and Hezbollah, fighting Iran directly, fighting the Houthis in Yemen, fighting Hamas in the West Bank and Gaza. And unfortunately, they're having to argue with Washington about whether they should get the arms they need to defend themselves. And it's an untenable position. And it's one that's not just going to hurt Israeli security, it's going to directly hurt American security too.
Well, I just heard last night some of the statistical metrics I track when it comes to these elections, and even with some of the missed opportunity from the last presidential debate, the Electoral College battle still shapes up fairly well for the Trump team if they can execute some good message and campaign discipline the next 45 50 days. If the Trump team gets back in charge of national security, Alex, how do you think they'll approach the Middle East differently, and reduce the risk of China, so American business owners can operate with more confidence going forward the next 4 years?
Mike, it starts with, like I said, we got to restore deterrence, right? So the Biden administration has allowed the military to atrophy. We're now, in some senses, we're in even worse position militarily than we were during the Obama years, which is really saying something. We got to restore our military capacity immediately, and we have to show through the strength of our leadership that we are willing to do what it takes to stop our adversaries from attacking our interests. We watched, the Houthis, which are a relatively small, not particularly capable proxy of Iran in Yemen, who are holding hostage international shipping with impunity, and raising prices and costs for American consumers and businesses because of what it's doing to international maritime traffic. And the Biden administration is basically just doing a tit for tat, shooting a $50 million missile at a $20 tent instead of working to eradicate the problem at its source. The idea that we would allow America's global shipping and maritime supply chains to be held hostage by this ragtag group of Iranian proxies is just preposterous. And we've got to, these are the type of things that we have to immediately start getting a handle on. And it's showing the Chinese that we are not going to allow them to bully Taiwan with impunity. We're not going to allow the Iranians to dictate to the entire region and hold them hostage with nuclear blackmail. We're not going to allow Israel to be bullied into sacrificing its own security. We're going to go, I think President Trump is going to go and the historic Abraham Accords, I think he's going to expand them to include more majority Muslim countries who are going to recognize Israel and who understand that Israel's not the enemy, Iran is their enemy. And so I think you're going to see a number of historic initiatives that we started in the first term continue. And the upshot of that is we're going to have more prosperity, more peace, and more stability for American businesses and consumers.
America's best days ahead, and when clients and fellow business owners are understandably concerned about the future, I like to remind them that the American people eventually get it right when they see the bad ideas creating messes, and there's some messes to clean up. But I always like to remind friends of one of my favorite Winston Churchill sayings, Alex: you can always count on America to do the right thing after they've tried everything else.
Absolutely.
So we really, really appreciate your extraordinary and valuable insights. I know our friends with the Committee for Oklahoma Prosperity will find this discussion fascinating, and we wish you tremendous success in all of your endeavors. And whoever the Trump team rustles up for term number 2, I hope they spend some good time picking your brain about the successes from the first term.
Well, thanks for having me, Mike, and thanks for all you're doing for our state.
The Committee for Oklahoma Prosperity is advancing ideas and policy that create growth and prosperity for the people of Oklahoma.